Good morning. We are gathered this morning in native space. We are gathered in native space and on the lands and the waters of the Massachusetts tribe. Welcome to the Resilient Boston Harbor Conference, sponsored by the Stone Living Lab. When Indigenous communities in the United States gather together, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land they are meeting on. Many non-Native communities have begun to incorporate this practice in public events, both to honor the Native peoples who belong to the land and to recognize that the use of the land by others has come as a result of the displacement of the land's original holders. I am here as a representative of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapaug to affirm the Massachusetts tribe as the traditional holders of the land in and around Boston. 10,000 years ago, Boston Harbor was dry land, and we were here. 1,000 years ago, much of what is now known as the city of Boston was underwater, and we were here. 400 years ago, English colonists came to occupy our land, and we were here. Today, most of Greater Boston is a major urban area occupied by others, and still we are here. Here is where our ancestors laughed, cried, loved, made music, practiced our beliefs, shared both food and knowledge, and made both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raised our children and buried and honored our dead. We remember what is now dry land when it was water, and we remember what is now water when it was dry land. We know this will change again. Here is where we continue to live, holding the land and traditions of our ancestors. And here is where our children's children will continue after us. Many people find it hard to imagine an urban environment as native space, but our connection to this place has not been affected despite thousands of years of both natural and man-made changes to our environment. The landscape is in the process of changing again, and we will continue our millennial-long connection to this place. This connection means honoring the water, remembering those who came before us, and preparing for those who will come after us. May all that we do in native spaces both honor the earth and prepare the way for all of those to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that very important perspective. My name is Paul Kirshen. I'm professor at UMass Boston School for the Environment, and I'm also director of the Stone Living Lab. And I want to welcome you all to this joint conference of the Stone Living Lab and the Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network. As many of you know, the Stone Living Lab is a partnership of the City of Boston, the National Park Service, Boston Harbor Now, UMass Boston, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, and the James N. and Catherine D. Stone Foundation. And the lab carries out research on the biophysical and social economic performance of nature-based approaches or solutions to manage coastal flooding and also to restore ecosystems. The Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network, or BHEN, is part of the Massachusetts National Estuary Program. Its members protect, restore, and educate the public about estuarine resources within the Metro Boston region. I want to thank the Conference Planning Committee for putting together this excellent program. The committee was quite large, so I just want to mention two members in particular. First is Mark Barilli, who is chair of this conference. The other is Brittany Knotts, who was the conference organizer and really has provided the glue and energy to put together this really incredible program. Also, of course, I want to thank all of you for attending and all the speakers for lending your expertise and knowledge to this workshop. I also want to thank the Stone Foundation for their vision and support of the Stone Living Lab and also for this conference. I want to remind you why we're here. We're here, first of all, to learn from each other. And second of all, to identify a path forward for research on coastal resiliency and ecosystems. The next part of this conference is a recorded message from UMass Boston Chancellor. He regrets he could not be here. We did put together a message for us, and this will be followed by Kathy Stone, who will introduce a plenary speaker. So why don't we go ahead and show this video from the Chancellor. And again, welcome everybody.
Massachusetts, Boston, it is my pleasure. Good morning. On behalf of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this important conference to advance research toward creating more resilient coastlines here in Boston Harbor and around the world. We are so very grateful to the Stone Foundation for helping to make this conference and the Stone Living Lab possible. I am also happy to acknowledge the partnership with the Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network and the Mass Bay's National Estuary in co-sponsoring this important work. I want to thank Kathy Stone and Secretary Theoharidis for your kind words of welcome. I would also like to personally thank our partners for their work with the Stone Living Lab, the City of Boston, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, the National Park Service, Boston Harbor Now, and of course, all of you for joining us here today. We are creating a new and dangerous phase of Earth's history that has been termed by Paul Crutzen, Nobel laureate in chemistry, the Anthropocene. We are now in an age where the immense effects of human activity on all aspects of Earth's physical systems and on all living systems on the planet have entered a new and dangerous phase. With unchecked climate change, we put ourselves at risk of massive crop failures, new and re-emerging infectious diseases, heat extremes, droughts, megastorms, floods, and ominously for our harbor city, sharply rising sea levels. Climate change is a serious threat to this generation and all that follow. Impacts on our coastal ecosystems and communities are among the greatest risks. Responding to this evolving challenge will require making difficult choices. The good news is that there is still time to act, but acting will require clear thinking and state-of-the-art data to develop the translational vehicles for us to best adapt to climate change. The ability to gather data through thoughtful, rigorous, interdisciplinary, innovative research and to use that data to inform decisions is critical to the success of our efforts. The work of the Stone Living Lab, our partners and co-sponsors, and of many of you in attendance today can help ensure that our path forward is one that not only reduces that threat, but provides ecological and societal benefits as well. As you participate in this conference, I challenge you all today to think deeply about the data and information being shared, the questions being asked, and the conversations that you're having. I ask you take the information, the data, the concepts you're learning and apply them to promoting climate resilience, be it as a researcher, a policymaker, a student, an educator, and perhaps most importantly, as a member of our community. The opportunity to learn from each other is invaluable, and I am pleased to see that this important work is being conducted right here in our city of Boston. I wish you all a productive conference, and I thank you all again for the important work you are doing to help respond to climate change in an equitable, responsible, and data-informed way. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor, for those very thoughtful words. And thank you all for being here today. In particular, I would like to thank the Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network for co-hosting the event, and thank the members of the Conference Planning Committee for their many, many weeks of work to make this event possible. My husband, Jim, and I are so proud to support the Living Lab at UMass Boston, a partnership that unites government, nonprofits, academics, and the private sector in common cause. As we know so well, the challenges that confront us today are enormous. They are environmental, they are social, they are political, and they will affect all of us in myriad ways. And of course, they will deeply affect our children and our grandchildren. The most recent news on climate change is grim. According to the most recent UN climate report, the rate at which our climate is warming, seas are rising, and storms are intensifying is much, much faster than we previously thought. These changes will affect Boston in consequential ways. Just the other week, many of you probably saw the arresting images of what various Boston landmarks look like based on different warming scenarios. At times, the challenges we face can seem insurmountable. And yet, as I often remind myself, there is still reason for optimism, because what we do today can and will make a difference, tomorrow. Here in Boston, we have the opportunity to harness the power of innovation to devise new ways to reduce and control emission, new ways to protect our precious resources, and new ways to make our human and built environment more resilient. This year, as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, I'm reminded of how far we have come as a community. We have a terrific park, just a short ferry trip from downtown Boston. We have a clean harbor where people of all backgrounds can swim, boat, fish. We have a city and state government deeply committed to environmental protection and coastal resiliency. And yet there is so much more to do. I have always believed that when it comes to issues of environmental protection, sustainability, and justice, one must work on multiple levels: the international level, the national level, the state level, and the local level. If we do not work simultaneously at all four scales, we will not achieve the durable change we want and need. The Stone Living Lab's credo is resilience through research. And I believe, and I know that's why we are all here today, to discuss the important research taking place in and around Boston Harbor and the important role all of us can play. But before we move on to the main event, I was asked to share a bit of my own history with the Boston Harbor Islands and how those experiences laid the foundation for the partnership that is now the lab. To do that, I need to take you back to the early 1990s when I was working with Mayor Menino as the Chief of the first chief of environment for the city of Boston. A proposal came across my desk to include the Harbor Islands in a national park based on their unusual geology. The islands are the only drumlin field in the United States that intersects a coastline. They were formed by the retreating glaciers some 15,000 years ago. I brought the proposal for the national park to the mayor, who then had a choice to make, whether to support the creation of a new park or respond to a competing offer from the gambling industry, which had offered contributions of more than $1 million to put casinos anchored to the islands, the money to go to human services. But I'll never forget what the mayor said. I don't need Disneyland in the harbor. I've got the real thing. So the mayor chose the park. We expected many years would pass before we became officially a national park. But one day I received a call from Senator Kennedy's staffers on a Monday saying that there would be an omnibus park bill. It would be voted in on Friday, and we were not in it. We were too new. We had had no hearings in the House, although we had hearings in the Senate. I got the same call on Tuesday and the same call on Wednesday. Given that the facts didn't change and the promise was that we would not be in the bill, I thought something was up and went to see the mayor. We checked over the legislation as it was proposed, and Friday we were in the legislation and we were a national park. This was done through an arrangement, if you will, between Senator Kennedy, Congressman Moakley, and Senator Owen Hatch, the way things typically used to be done in Washington. But for all the way that it did happen, in order for us to have a park, we needed to work at the city, state, and federal level. And the park that has emerged, the National and State Park, is unique in the country. It's managed by a 13-member partnership representing state, federal, municipal, and nonprofit sectors. And the past 25 years, this partnership has only grown stronger. A few years back, when we started realizing the consequences of climate change were coming much faster than many thought, we knew that once again, we needed to come together as a community. We would need to have a robust partnership to address the challenges of sea rise, intensifying storms, increased flooding, erosion of habitat, disappearing green space, and of course, these new and all of the ways in which these disproportionately affect underserved communities. To confront these challenges over the short and long term, we need cooperation among scientists of many disciplines, as well as a deep involvement of neighborhoods and community-based organizations. We also need to educate and train the next generation of scientists, scholars, and leaders, which must, of course, include more students from diverse backgrounds. So today, I'm pleased to see the lab bringing us together to learn from one another about research and resilience on the harbor. We have a terrific agenda today, and I wish you a day of rich dialogue, along with the opportunity to strengthen existing connections and hopefully make new ones. So it is now my privilege to introduce the Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy of Environmental Affairs, Kathleen Theoharides, whom many of you know. The Secretary brings a deep passion and commitment to her work on behalf of the Commonwealth. She is a proud graduate of the master's program at UMass Boston and is so particularly meaningful for us that she is delivering plenary remarks for today's conference. Since 2019, the Secretary has overseen Massachusetts energy and environmental agencies tasked with protecting, preserving, and enhancing the Commonwealth's environmental resources while ensuring a clean energy future for the state. Upon joining the Baker-Polito administration in 2016, She led the development of the State Hazardous Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan and created the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Since her appointment as secretary, she has spearheaded key initiatives to advance the administration's climate, clean energy, and environmental agenda, including establishing a nation-leading target of net zero by 2050 and promoting the development of offshore wind in Massachusetts. She's also led negotiations that resulted in nation-leading climate legislation signed by the governor in 2021. Please join me in giving the secretary a warm Zoom welcome for joining us here today. Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. It's good to see many familiar faces. And a big congratulations to Kathy and the Stone Foundation for this very generous gift and the opportunity for partnership. It is a momentous time in Massachusetts on climate change and indeed around the world. In just a few weeks, countries from across the world and states from across our nation will gather in Glasgow for COP26 for the International Climate Talks. And it's an opportunity for the world to come together to renew our focus on climate action and increase our ambition to take on this generational challenge. For some time now, states, including Massachusetts, have been attending the COP to highlight the role of subnational climate leaders, particularly over the last 4 years when the US was not doing enough on the national stage to meet climate change objectives and had pulled out of the Paris Agreement. But we've also gone to learn from each other in other countries and to make important connections to those working on climate solutions. In Massachusetts, we continue to go proudly as we set the bar high for climate action in the United States. As Kathy mentioned, we have the most ambitious emission reduction target in the country, both for 2030 and for 2050, with a handful of states pursuing net zero by 2050 mandatory requirements. We're also pursuing historic investments in resiliency and clean energy. Since coming into office in 2015, the Baker-Polito administration has committed to an all-of-government approach to build more resilient communities that are better prepared for coastal storms, for sea level rise, intense precipitation and extreme storm events, heat, and other challenges presented by climate change. And our experience with COVID-19 has only reinforced the importance of being prepared and investing in the resilience of our communities. Massachusetts is already experiencing the impacts of climate change, and we project these changes to only intensify over time. This summer, we experienced 4 significant heat waves, more than 25 days over 90 degrees, 3 tropical storms, a record amount of precipitation, and significant flooding across the state, and much more significant flooding in some of our neighbor states to the south. And today, as a nor'easter passes over our beaches and coastal communities, we're most of the way through what is likely to be one of the warmest Octobers on record. No frost yet in eastern Massachusetts. Even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases today as a globe, climate change impacts are already in motion. Our efforts must center on reducing emissions as much as possible, as quickly as possible, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But at the same time, we have to adapt to the impacts that are already unavoidable. Sometimes that feels like defeat, and I think adaptation has gotten a bad rap in the past, but our efforts to build resilience are critical, even as we work to stop the fundamental causes of this change. Beyond the impacts to our health and our homes, climate change also presents significant economic impacts for our state and the Northeast region. The Northeast is projected to experience some of the most dramatic impacts from climate change, from extreme temperature to drought impacting crop yields in our agricultural industry, to significant inland flooding threatening homes, businesses, and critical municipal infrastructure. Throughout the Commonwealth, we have significant infrastructure in harm's way. 370 miles of revetments and seawalls, 3,000 dams, 300 of which are deemed high hazard, and more than 25,000 culverts and small bridges, which were constructed largely more than 70 years ago under very different conditions. At the local level, there are over 1,100 municipally owned coastal structures in 62 coastal communities that need significant funding to bring these structures back to operational levels. Massachusetts is basically old, and it was designed for a different time under different climate conditions. Back in 2016, Governor Baker signed Executive Order 569, which established an aggressive strategy to include sound science as the basis to prepare the Commonwealth for climate change, to develop the State Hazard Mitigation and Adaptation Plan, and launch the Resilient Massachusetts Action Team to ensure that there was progress building resilience across state government and in cities and towns. And our administration continues to expand its investment in adaptation strategies statewide, spending over $1 billion since 2015 to respond to the challenges of climate change. A centerpiece of this strategy is our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which I know many of you are familiar with. It's now actively engaging 93% or 328 of our 351 municipalities in climate resilience planning and action. Through this program, communities receive funding and technical assistance to begin the process of assessing their vulnerabilities to climate change, identifying strengths that they can build on, and then prioritizing action. And then we offer a follow-on grant program to offer real dollars for nature-based solutions, for infrastructure improvements, and a number of other types of projects to build resiliency. Through MVP, we funded over 230 of these types of implementation projects that range from hazardous dam removal and culvert right sizing to tree planting and living shorelines. We've also trained over 500 certified MVP planners across the state, including graduate students who lead community-based MVP workshops all around the Commonwealth. At its heart, MVP pairs local engagement with the best science and data and planning to help communities build not only a more climate-ready community, but a more resilient community in terms of all measures of community health. We're also working across state government to better incorporate climate change into state spending decisions, permitting, and policy. This spring, we launched a new climate resilience design standards tool to better incorporate climate resilience in the statewide capital planning process and develop consistent design standards across agencies. With this information, we can better inform climate smart capital planning and ensure our long-term investments with state dollars are not further increasing climate vulnerability, but serving to enhance local resilience. This summer, we were proud to award $21 million through our MVP program, doubling the program budget from 2020 to assist cities and towns as they pursue the urgent work necessary to address the impacts of climate change. This program has grown from a $500,000 program in 2017 all the way up to an annual number of 20 million, which I think highlights the need and the interest from our cities and towns. Including this year's funding, the total investment so far has been $65 million. We're proud of these numbers, and it's a significant investment that has helped a large majority of the Commonwealth cities and towns begin to move forward on climate adaptation priorities, but we believe it represents just a fraction of the significant and urgent need in our communities. The risk from flooding, extreme heat, and other climate impacts are only increasing, and so the time really to act to build this funding is now. All of these projects need assistance, investment, and they need it sooner than later. Governor Baker has filed ARPA legislation that would direct close to $1 billion for these types of priorities. And as part of this $1 billion funding, there is $300 million specifically to invest in climate resilient infrastructure, $400 million to support needed upgrades and modernization projects for critical water and sewer infrastructure, and another $100 million for land conservation and resilient lands. Our municipal partners through the MVP program are clearly demonstrating that the Commonwealth is ready to take on climate change and build local resiliency, and that this opportunity is ready for communities to build back better. I should also talk a little bit about the work ongoing at the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Last year, DCR established an Office of Climate Resilience to guide the agency as it takes on the work to prepare for the impacts of climate change. This office is currently developing a statewide climate change vulnerability assessment methodology, which DCR will use to inform climate adaptation initiatives at each of its properties. The results will allow DCR to better understand the degree to which assets are exposed to natural hazards and climate stressors. And once completed, these assessments will help guide short and long-term management of historical buildings, beaches, parkways, flood control, forests, playgrounds, rinks, pools, and other landscapes under our stewardship. It's quite a diverse portfolio. This is a significant challenge, and DCR is taking an approach that ensures we protect the special character and natural resources of the Commonwealth to ensure that our parks and forests and treasures throughout Massachusetts are strong and resilient, and that they're here for our children and future generations. One example is DCR's efforts to plan a resilient and adaptive design for the Draw 7 Park in Somerville that includes features for flood control, stormwater management improvements, and living shoreline. The project will also expand tree canopy to help mitigate the urban heat island effect. With adaptive designs like what we were planning at Draw 7, it's important to ensure we employ the latest academic research and data in decision-making around natural strategies to address climate impacts through mitigation, prevention, and adaptation. These are efforts we need to undertake at parks and open spaces across the Commonwealth. There is so much work ahead of us, and we know that effective partnerships are absolutely critical to building the strong, resilient Commonwealth we've all been working to achieve. That's why I'm very pleased to announce today that the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs and the Department of Conservation and Recreation will enter into a memorandum of understanding, along with the City of Boston, Boston Harbor Now, the National Park Service, the University of Massachusetts Boston School for the Environment, to address this generational challenge of climate change. Through this MOU, our administration is committed to working with these valued partners to support nature-based approaches to climate adaptation, coastal resilience, and ecological restoration within the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. As part of this effort, we will focus on sharing information and experiences on the development and management of solutions that address these and other climate change challenges. Support a cutting-edge living lab research center that will promote scientific understanding regarding coastal resilience and adaptation in and around the Boston Harbor and the Boston Harbor Islands, including Rainsford Island and DCR properties, while also promoting recreational opportunities for the public. We'll build alliances with academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and community groups to engage researchers, students, and the public in developing and testing innovative, adaptive, nature-based approaches to climate change. And that's all because the Stone Living Lab is going to offer this opportunity. It offers our state a tremendous chance to collect critical data around Boston Harbor, beginning with baseline monitoring at Rainsford Island, as well as a pilot project at Fallon Pier at UMass Boston. Through the work of the Stone Living Lab, we'll be able to work together to ensure nature-based solutions work in increasingly volatile and unpredictable weather conditions, to help implement climate resilient solutions that address historic inequities and environmental justice, and identify priority areas for research and investment. The Boston Harbor Islands are particularly vulnerable to impacts from climate change, and it will take hard work, collaboration, and effective public-private partnerships to preserve and protect these places for generations to come. But one of the real benefits of the structure of the Stone Living Laboratory is the collection of data on real-world infrastructure in actual New England storm conditions, not simulated in a traditional lab. It's also a benefit that we have this great resource of students and researchers here in the community who will be able to access this opportunity. Then we can use that data and learning to inform solutions at a much broader scale. I really believe this is the kind of collaboration we need going forward that can serve as a model for similar efforts and partnerships across the country. And I know as a former graduate student, I would have been very excited to participate in something like this as a student. We're so pleased to be working with tremendous partners and for the exciting work ahead. And so I would really like to thank you all for this partnership and support as we work to build the Commonwealth, a Commonwealth that is more resilient and ready for the future. And a special thanks to the Stone Foundation for their very generous gift. I have time, I think, for a few questions now.
Excellent. Thank you, Secretary. So we do have a few questions for you. The first one is, you're going to jump right into it. I should introduce myself. I'm Mark Borelli. I'm the research director at the Stone Living Lab. And again, thank you. That was a wonderful set of comments. There's a lot of information there, and it's really encouraging that Massachusetts is doing so much in this area. It's really, really positive to hear. But for your first question, what research questions does the state have that researchers attending this conference might help your office address?
We have tons of questions. So
that's
it. That is a great question in and of itself. But you know, I think that there are certainly questions around particularly demonstration projects for nature-based solutions. What works, what different techniques work. I can think of anything from some of the wetland deposition and accretion studies that have been going on in the Great Marsh, for example, to different types of substrate, to if you're going to remove an invasive species like Phragmites, what is the best way to ensure you're not getting the coastal erosion that might happen? And how does this all happen against a backdrop of increased freshwater inputs and things like this into coastal systems? But I think my team would be happy to share a very full list. I know we have lots of data we've been gathering from communities and subsequent questions with it. I think one of the things that's a real opportunity here is a lot of the nature-based solutions that are out there have not necessarily been tested either in Massachusetts or at scale. You know, we're seeing projects pop up with much more frequency, whether it's ecological restoration of salt marshes or oyster reefs or what have you. But I think there is a real need to continue to deploy and monitor and prove out these strategies so that we can use them at a broader scale across the state.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the list would be great. We'd love to see some of the larger questions. We could probably
pull that together pretty quickly.
There's a lot of researchers out here. So, and you did list a lot of the things that Massachusetts is doing, and again, it's great to hear. But what do you think is still the most challenging obstacles to increasing our coastal resiliency in Boston Harbor and along other developed shorelines in Massachusetts?
Well, I think you just said it in a word there. The high development of our shoreline is obviously a challenge. I think, you know, in an ideal world, our salt marshes and coastal marshes would still be available as that buffer for sea level rise and coastal erosion and flooding. And in most cases, they are not well preserved up and down our coastline, although we've done you know, a better job than many other states in terms of protecting our dunes and coastal beaches. So challenges, we have a heavily developed shoreline and a need to create more soft solutions, which are really the most effective at buffering from the impacts of climate change. So that's a challenge. I think there is the challenge of hard infrastructure like seawalls in certain places, and figuring out what to do. Each circumstance is different. I think there will also be difficult conversations at the community level around possible retreat and what that means, and when it might be time to figure out a phased way to pull back from the coastline. So I think there's any number of challenges, but here in an environment that is very developed with our economic center for the state right on the coast, that really is the primary challenge I see.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard. You can't do science at the coast without getting involved in politics a little. There's always things going on there. So that was the challenging part. What are the low-hanging fruit that we could do as a Commonwealth or even as individuals to increase that coastal resiliency along these shorelines?
So I think we have a lot of opportunities for ecological restoration, whether it's looking at riparian corridors and making sure we're returning rivers to a more natural ability to flood and move along the riverbank. Vermont's done a lot of great work there. And our team at the Division of Ecological Restoration is doing a lot with dam removal and stream restoration to improve the ability of water to move, you know, in and out of the riverbank. But that opportunity exists in coastal systems as well, whether it's with dune restoration, nourishment, or planting and coastal marsh restoration. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to increase the effectiveness and the ability of our natural systems to bounce back. And that's not just, we have a long tradition of land conservation in the state, including in urban areas. But I think we have to do more to not only protect more land, but to manage the land that we already do have, to make sure that we're managing it both for carbon sequestration and for resiliency benefits. And you can often get both of them at the same time, which is a bonus as well. I think there's a number of low-hanging fruit that we're identifying through our MVP program around building more resilient communities through connecting neighborhoods, making sure that elderly populations, non-English speaking populations aren't isolated during emergencies, making sure things like storm evacuation routes are known to everyone and clearly articulated, and making sure people know where to go to get help as we're seeing more extreme weather. And so I think there's a whole element to this on the sort of non-physical side of adaptation that is more low-hanging fruit that I think a lot of us saw, through hurricanes in our own experience, but it's something that is front and center through our MVP program.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. So now you were a grad student at UMass, and I have students here, and we are virtually at a university today, so I would get in trouble if I didn't ask this question. But what advice would you give to students as they prepare for a career in the fields that are related to coastal resiliency?
It's a good question. I think, if you want to go into a field that is very applied, as I feel this one is, it's great to get real world experience in your research. And so, I said I would have loved to have the opportunity to work on a project like this, because I think it gives you that exposure to the science, obviously, which is first and foremost, but also to how the application of that science works in the real world, whether it's looking at the permitting that goes into some of this, or thinking about the questions that designers or planners or municipal leaders might have around these techniques. I found it useful to, UMass Boston is actually where I took my first environmental policy course. And so having that grounding in how the science is connected to ecological decision-making is a really good experience for a student sort of interested in this type of intersectional cross-cutting type of field. So I think getting that experience. I also found it useful to talk with architects, designers, students in other fields to understand, again, how the science could be applied to some of these decisions.
Excellent. Wow. All right. Last question we have, or the last one of the pre-questions is, so the Stone Foundation has provided funding for the Stone Lab, as you know, and it's a large part of the reason why we're here today. What do you think is a good model for sustainable funding? Because funding is always an issue for scientists and researchers. But what's a sustainable model for funding the types of long-term data collection and analysis that drive, sound policy?
So I always think of the NSF long-term ecological stations as a sort of fundamental building block of the ecological data sets we've been able to collect on terrestrial and coastal ecosystems to date. And I think that's the type of model we're going to need to expand significantly for adaptation science, right? I mean, we've been able to see those systems change as a result of climate change over many, many years. I had the opportunity to work at Harvard Forest as a student, where some of the warming experiments were going on, and that data is laying the groundwork for any number of studies on climate change and on ecosystem change. But I think we need something similar for adaptation and interventions in the natural system to adapt to climate change. And we probably need it in almost every system in the country, right? Because some of these solutions are not going to be the same, and particularly as we're seeing things like species shift and understanding how species composition is going to affect ecosystem dynamics, and how climate is going to play into all of that is going to be pretty complicated. And then there's the role of all of us tinkering with that. And so I would advocate for long-term federal science funding, and it probably could come from a variety of places: USGS, NSF, some of the other agencies, and on the state side as well, to really get our arms around what is happening to ecosystems, what's happening to communities as a result of climate change, and then what are the interventions that work. Because I think a lot of what's held us back in this field, to a certain extent, is a lack of data, a lack of consistent techniques, and a lack of sort of being able to monitor the outcomes of these projects right over time, because you don't always see the adaptation. You might get a sense that something did better after an extreme storm, but many of these projects are planned for a future that we haven't seen yet. So,
all right,
more investment is needed, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. But as you said before, $65 million, that's a lot of money at the state to put up to do this kinds of research, and it's pretty broad and wide ranging. So that's great to hear. It's good to be a researcher in Massachusetts. That's not always the case. All right, so I want everybody to thank the Secretary for her time and speaking with us this morning. Again, that Zoom, the Zoom thank you is good.
Thank you.
Now, yep, okay. Thanks again.
Thanks.
I just wanted to just give a quick, we're gonna have a break in a few minutes. I'm just gonna give a quick overview of what we're doing here. Again, my name is Mark Borelli. I'm a coastal geologist. As I said earlier, I'm the research director for the lab. First, I want to thank the Secretary for her remarks and participating in that Q&A, and all the other speakers that came before. On behalf of the Stone Living Lab, I want to say we're all excited to be here today. I know that you're all aware that we have a lot of work to do today and in the future. I have a high schooler at home who keeps reminding me that my generation basically ruined the environment. So I'd like to be able to report back that we're doing something because I usually just blame her grandparents' generation. So we should try to do something. But Massachusetts in general, as the Secretary was mentioning, and Boston in particular, we have a long and I think deserved reputation for unique and innovative approaches to academic, technological, societal challenges. And the Stone Lab here at UMass, Boston Harbor Now, Boston Harbor Ecosystem Network at Northeastern, and many other groups are here today and are addressing, pretty much one of the most pressing issues of our time. We're addressing climate change along our coast, supporting or conducting this rigorous research that we want to do to better understand all possible outcomes and help regulators and policymakers make informed decisions, right? We are very aware today, this is our first of many conferences, hopefully. But like I said, we have lots of work to do. We see this as laying the foundation, right? We want to come out of this with something today. We're going to share everything that we have with you all today. Coastal systems, as you know, are complex, multi-use, multi-jurisdictional, but they provide that invaluable ecosystem services that everyone should be able to benefit from and enjoy equally. So let's figure that out today. And if you guys have your agenda, the agenda's on the screen. So we're gonna have a break now. We're gonna come back at 11:15 sharp, and we're gonna start our lightning talks. We have 6 talks, and then after those talks, if they're 5 minutes each, you're gonna have the opportunity to talk to the speakers. So we're not gonna have questions during the talks, but after those talks, you'll be able to go into certain breakout rooms of your choice and go to speak to different speakers. You can bounce around from room to room if you like. We're also gonna have poster sessions. So you can talk to the authors, you can talk to some of the poster sessions. And then after that, we'll have lunch. Lunch is about an hour. Lunch is on your own, right? We have, after that, we'll have 3 consecutive breakout sessions. We'll break out into smaller groups. So we have, I think we have 200 people signed up. So we're gonna break out into smaller groups for each breakout session. Each breakout session will have a facilitator and a note taker. And we'll be using the Padlet app, which helps us. So you can write into the Padlet app. You can read what other people are saying in the Padlet app. And then each session, again, should last about an hour. We'll have 3 guiding questions for each breakout session. We'll have like 30 minutes or so to talk about those 3 guiding questions. And then we'll come back into the larger group and report out, right? So we'll do that 3 times, and then we wrap up with what I'm really excited about is seeing a short presentation by our graphic facilitator, Sherry Kennedy, of Fusionary Thinking. This should be really cool. She's right there. Hey, Sherry. This would be really cool. This is one of the drags of not being there in person, because this should be this wonderful, long, visual that we'd get to see and walk around. But Sherry's going to share that with us at the end. And we're going to sort of conclude with some summary remarks, and then we're done for the day. So that's it. Again, we're going to come back here at 11:15 sharp, and we're going to start the breakout session. So I would just, if I were you all, I would probably just stay here, shut your video, mute yourselves, but don't log off, and then try and log back on. That's it. Thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you at 11:15.